Welcome back to Bedtime Myths and Mysteries. Tonight, we enter one of the strangest stories of the Second World War. Not a battle fought with Spitfires, tanks, or warships, but with candles, secrecy, and belief. In the summer of 1940, Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany. Across the Channel, invasion barges gathered. In the skies, the RAF fought for survival. And somewhere in the New Forest, according to one remarkable occult legend, a group of British witches gathered beneath the trees to send Adolf Hitler a message. You cannot cross the sea. It sounds absurd at first. A wartime ghost story. A patriotic myth wrapped in candle smoke. But the more closely we look, the more interesting it becomes. Because whether the ritual truly happened exactly as described is only part of the mystery. The deeper question is why people believed such a thing could matter at all. In 1940, Britain was not simply defending its coastline, it was defending its mind. And when a nation begins to fear that everything familiar may be destroyed, it will reach for every weapon it has, even the invisible ones. By the summer of 1940, Europe had changed shape with terrifying speed. Poland had fallen. Norway had fallen. Denmark, Belgium, the Netherlands and France had fallen. The British army had escaped from Dunkirk, but escape is not the same as victory. It had left behind vehicles, artillery, ammunition, supplies, the heavy bones of a modern army. The men had come home, but much of their strength had remained on the beaches. Britain now faced the possibility that German soldiers might soon come across the Channel. Not in theory, not as a distant nightmare, but as a practical military plan. German commanders prepared Operation Sea Lion, the proposed invasion of Britain. Barges were gathered, ports were studied, landing zones were examined. The southern coast became a line of expectation, villages prepared for occupation. Signposts were removed, beaches were defended, church bells were reserved as invasion alarms. Across Britain, ordinary people were told to watch the roads, watch the skies, and watch the sea. But there was another kind of watchfulness too. Older, stranger, and harder to record in official documents. For centuries, Britain had lived with two religions of fear. One was public, church, empire, king, law, country. The other was private. Charms beneath thresholds, witch marks scratched into beams, horseshoes over doors, old shoes hidden inside walls, whispered protections against the evil eye. Even in the 20th century, when the age of aircraft and radio had arrived, the old instincts had not completely died. People still knocked on wood, sailors still feared unlucky omens. Families still kept little rituals they could not quite explain. So when invasion seemed possible, some people prayed. Some joined the home guard, some blacked out their windows, some watched for parachutes, and some perhaps did something older. The central figure in this story is Gerald Gardner, a man who would later become one of the most important names in modern witchcraft. Gardner was born in the 19th century, worked for years overseas, and returned to Britain with a deep interest in folklore, ritual, magic, and the hidden life of old traditions. He moved in occult circles at a time when spiritualism, ceremonial magic, Rosicrucian groups, theosophy, folk custom, and esoteric societies all overlapped in strange and fascinating ways. Gardner later claimed that in 1939, shortly before the war darkened Britain completely, he was initiated into a surviving witch cult in the New Forest. That phrase alone needs careful handling. Modern historians are rightly cautious about claims of an unbroken ancient witch religion surviving intact from pre-Christian times. The old theory, popularized by Margaret Murray, has been largely rejected by scholars, but rejected theories can still shape real people. Gardner and others believed, or wanted to believe, that they had found a living remnant of something older than the church, older than modern Britain, older than the state itself. And if they believed that, then the next step was not ridiculous to them. If old witches had once protected the land, perhaps they could do it again. According to Gardner's later account, the ritual took place around Lammas in 1940, a traditional seasonal festival at the beginning of August. The location was the New Forest, that ancient stretch of woodland in southern England where heath, oak, deer paths, mist, and old stories gather naturally together. It is not difficult to see why the legend chose such a place. The New Forest already feels like a borderland, not wild in the untouched sense, but old enough to make modern life feel temporary. Imagine it now. Night beneath the trees, the air damp with summer warmth and the smell of leaves. No electric brightness, no public ceremony, no cheering crowd. Only a small group moving quietly through the dark, careful not to draw attention in a country at war. Above them, the threat of German aircraft. Beyond them, the Channel. Across that narrow strip of water, an army that had already devoured nations. They were not soldiers. Many versions of the legend describe them as older people, some frail, some already worn by age. That detail gives the story its strange power. Not young warriors with rifles, but elderly occultists, witches, ritualists, believers, people who had no divisions, no bombers, no fleets, only will. The working they allegedly performed was known as the Cone of Power. In magical theory, the idea is simple but dramatic. A group gathers in a circle. Through chanting, dancing, concentration, and shared intention, they raise psychic or spiritual force. That force is imagined as rising upward from the circle, gathering into a cone, and then being directed toward a chosen target. It is not supposed to be random emotion, it is supposed to be focused will, a weapon made from belief. And in this case, the target was Adolf Hitler. But the story does not say the witches tried to kill him. That would be a different kind of legend. Instead, the message they supposedly sent was more subtle, more psychological, and in some ways more unnerving. They tried to plant an idea in the mind of the Nazi leadership. You cannot cross the sea. You cannot come. You cannot invade. Britain is beyond your reach. That is what makes the legend so fascinating. It is not a fireball fantasy, it is not thunderbolts from the clouds, it is magical warfare, imagined as suggestion, as mental resistance, as a kind of occult propaganda aimed directly into the enemy's confidence. And confidence mattered. Operation Sea Lion depended on more than ambition. It depended on German control of the air, coordination across the Channel, the movement of troops and equipment by vulnerable vessels, and the ability to sustain an invasion once ashore. The Channel was not simply water, it was weather, tides, mines, ships, aircraft, confusion and risk. Britain's greatest defensive wall was not made of stone, it was made of distance just wide enough to become deadly. So the alleged magical message, "You cannot cross the sea," was not random. It struck at the exact nerve of the invasion plan. In Gardner's telling, this was not the first time such magic had been used. He claimed that witches had sent similar force against earlier invasion threats, against the Spanish Armada and later against Napoleon. Historically, storms, logistics, naval power, politics, and military decisions explain those events far better than ritual magic. But folklore rarely replaces history by accident. It grows around moments where survival feels miraculous. When an island is threatened, the sea becomes sacred. When enemies fail to cross it, people ask why. The official answer may be ships and weather. The unofficial answer may be that the land itself refused them. That is the emotional truth behind the Cone of Power legend. It imagines Britain not merely as a defended nation, but as an enchanted island, a place with a hidden immune system. When danger comes, the old powers wake. The ritual itself is usually described in stark, almost uncomfortable terms. The witches were said to have worked skyclad, naked, as part of their rite, though that detail is difficult to separate from Gardner's later descriptions of witchcraft practice and the sensational appetite of readers. Some versions say the participants danced until exhausted. Some say a chant was repeated again and again, driving the message outward across the sea. Some say the physical effort was too much for the older members, and that a few later died from the strain or exposure. That part of the story should be treated carefully. It is powerful, but it also has the texture of martyrdom added after the fact. Every legend wants sacrifice. Every secret war wants casualties. If no names can be proven, the dead become symbolic, the old giving the last of their strength so the young might survive. Still, even as legend, it is a striking image. Elderly witches in a forest, offering their remaining vitality against a dictator who had turned half of Europe into a graveyard. Whether one believes in magic or not, the human need inside the story is undeniable. By September 1940, the Battle of Britain had reached its critical phase. German aircraft attacked British airfields, radar stations, ports and cities. Pilots fought in the skies while civilians listened from below, counting engine notes, waiting for sirens, learning the grammar of danger. Britain's survival depended on the RAF not breaking. And it did not break. The Luftwaffe failed to gain the air superiority Germany needed for invasion. On 17th September 1940, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion. Later, the plan faded further as Germany turned its attention eastward toward the Soviet Union. The invasion never came. That is the historical reality. But legends do not live inside reality alone. They live in the gap between what happened and what people feel must have happened. Britain survived. Hitler did not cross the channel. The witches, according to the story, had told him he could not come, and he did not. For believers, that was not coincidence, it was proof. For skeptics, it was timing. Military failure, RAF resistance, naval danger, German overreach, the cold machinery of war grinding against practical limits. The truth is probably not that a circle of witches single-handedly stopped Nazi Germany. That would insult the pilots, sailors, soldiers, factory workers, code breakers, radar operators, ambulance drivers, firefighters and civilians who endured the war with real bodies in real danger. But it would also be too easy to dismiss the story as nonsense and move on, because the Cone of Power legend reveals something profound about wartime Britain. It shows us that war is never fought only on maps. It is fought in nerves, in rumors, in dreams, in kitchen conversations, in prayers whispered by bedsides, in lucky charms carried in pockets, in the belief that the enemy can be resisted not only by force, but by refusal. A nation under threat must imagine itself surviving before it can survive. And imagination in wartime is not decorative, it is armor. There is also something deeply British about the story's oddness. Other countries might tell myths of shining heroes or divine armies. Britain gives us elderly witches in a damp forest telling Hitler to shove off across the channel. It is bizarre, theatrical, half comic, half magnificent, and somehow more believable because of that. Not believable as military fact, perhaps, but believable as national temperament. The legend also sits at the strange birth of modern witchcraft. After the war, Britain changed. The old Witchcraft Act, which had made it a crime to claim magical powers, was repealed in 1951 and replaced by the Fraudulent Mediums Act. In 1954, Gardner published Witchcraft Today, helping bring modern Wicca into public awareness. What had once been hidden, whispered, or denied began to step into print, radio, interviews, and popular culture. But by then, the war story had become part of the inheritance. For Gardner and those who followed him, the Cone of Power was not merely a rumor. It was a founding myth of modern witchcraft's public identity. Witches had not been wicked servants of darkness, but secret defenders of the land. They had not cursed Britain. They had protected it. At the exact moment the modern world faced one of its greatest evils, the old religion, so the story suggested, had stood quietly on the right side of history. That is powerful mythology, and like all powerful mythology, it asks to be believed even when the evidence is thin. The historian's problem is simple. There are no strong contemporary records from 1940 proving that the ritual happened exactly as later described. Much of what we have comes after the fact, from Gardner and people connected to the world of modern witchcraft. Memory shifts. Movements create origin stories. Participants protect secrets. Storytellers improve details. And once a legend becomes useful, it becomes very difficult to untangle faith from fact. But absence of evidence is not quite evidence of absence either. Secret rituals, by nature, do not usually leave tidy paperwork. A small group could have gathered in the New Forest and performed a magical working against invasion. That is not impossible. Britain in 1940 contained spiritualists, occultists, ceremonial magicians, folk practitioners, eccentrics, patriots, and frightened people willing to do whatever they thought might help. The most sensible answer is also the most haunting. Something may have happened, but the story we inherited is almost certainly polished by memory, belief, and myth. And perhaps that is why it still works. If the tale were proven completely, it would become a footnote. If disproven completely, it would become a fraud. But balanced between possibility and invention, it becomes folklore. It becomes one of those stories that tells us less about what governments did and more about what people needed to imagine in order to endure. Picture the final image. The forest after the ritual. The circle broken. The candles low. The old bodies tired. The sea unseen but present, waiting beyond the dark fields and roads. Somewhere above Europe, bombers are being prepared. Somewhere in Berlin, maps are being studied. Somewhere in Britain, a mother is putting a child to bed under a blacked-out window. Somewhere, a pilot is trying to sleep before dawn. And in the mind of the legend, something has been sent across the water. Not a bomb, not a bullet, not a curse, a command. You cannot cross the sea. Maybe Hitler never heard it. Maybe no mind was touched. Maybe the only people changed by the ritual were the people who performed it. But even that matters. Because courage is not always the belief that you will win. Sometimes courage is the refusal to let fear have the final word. The occult war against the Nazis was not fought in the official histories. It was fought in the margins, in the candlelit imagination of people who believed that evil could be resisted by more than weapons, and while we should never confuse legend with strategy, we should not underestimate the force of a story that tells frightened people they are not powerless. In the end, the RAF held, the invasion failed, Britain endured, and the witches of the New Forest, whether historical actors, patriotic mythmakers, or something in between, became part of a stranger truth that during the darkest nights of war, even modern nations dream in ancient symbols. Because when the enemy gathers across the water, and the sky fills with engines, and the future narrows to one terrible question, what can we do? Some people reach for rifles, some reach for prayer, some reach for maps, and some, standing beneath old trees in the blacked-out dark, raise their hands to the night and answer with magic. So the next time you hear that Hitler never crossed the channel because of pilots, radar, weather, naval power, and military failure, remember that is the history. But somewhere beneath it, half hidden like a charm under a floorboard, there is another story. A circle in the forest, a cone of will, and a message sent into the dark. You cannot come. If you enjoyed tonight's journey into the stranger edges of history, folklore, and belief, subscribe to Bedtime Myths and Mysteries. There are many more old stories waiting in the dark, and not all of them are willing to stay buried.